And I can give you the floor. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. So I'm sharing the slides for today's workshop. Hopefully you can see the agenda on the screen now. I'm seeing some nods. Great.
Yes.
So we're going to start off by talking about the objectives. We're going to talk about different cost elements, and then we're going to dive into the detail of how you work out some of those cost elements. We're going to finish up with a summary, and there will be plenty of time for Q&A afterwards. But something that I really want to emphasize is please ask questions at any time, especially if I'm saying things that you don't understand, that don't make sense. You can put your hand up or talk in the chat, or just unmute and say something, especially if I haven't noticed, because I won't be keeping an eye on the chat. So ask questions at any time, and then once we've gone through the slides, there will be time dedicated when we can go through I'd be happy to work on an example if anyone wants to share their own example, and we can work on that live, something like that. Okay. So starting off, what we're trying to achieve. Now, this workshop is primarily aimed at people who are thinking of putting in bids on the Innovative Manufacturing in Africa project. But we have opened it up as a pricing for production workshop, so there may be some other people on the call as well, I'm not sure. So, sorry, does somebody have a question?
No, I think someone joined and I just muted this person.
Okay, great, thank you. So primarily for people who are thinking of putting in bids on the Innovative Manufacturing in Africa project, but we're talking in general terms about how you price something that you're making. So hopefully the information is useful in other situations as well. Now, there are sort of competing objectives here. When you're trying to figure out how to price an item that you're making, first of all, you absolutely do not want to be losing money on whatever price you set. And above that, you actually want to be making money. It needs to be worth your while for the time and effort that you spend on it. Against that, you don't want to set your price too high because you may lose the business. That's always a risk, that there are other people out there also trying to make things. So it's about trying to find the balance between these points. And something that I want to stress from the start is that it's an art, not a science. Even when you say working out what your costs are, because it's numbers, you think it's there's an absolute truth about it, but there are different ways to work out costs. There isn't one single truth. So I would say overall, definitely that pricing is an art, not a science. And in line with that, my slides aren't moving on, just a second. There we go. Here's a quote from John Maynard Keynes, the economist, that I think is useful in many areas of life, but definitely when it comes to working out how to price things. It's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. So don't spend a lot of time working out with precision something that isn't going to make a big difference to the overall numbers. But do make sure you've got all the big categories of costs included. So on that note, we're going to dive into talking about some different categories of costs. So first of all, direct versus indirect costs. Direct costs are things that you can very directly attribute to the fact that you're making a particular order. So if you are going to make tables, then the cost of the wood that you buy to make those tables is very clearly a direct cost. Similarly, the labor and many other things. There are also some costs that are indirect, and which costs fall into which category can be different depending on the scenario. So if there is a carpenter who is going to make tables using their own equipment, and they have a workshop and they have a lathe and some other tools in that workshop, then the rent and the cost of maintaining those machines and so on is an indirect cost. So it's because they're going to have to pay it every month, no matter how many orders they get. On the other hand, if it's a carpenter who is able to use a makerspace, let's say, then the cost of using machines may be a direct cost, because maybe they just need to go in and pay by the hour to access a lathe. So some costs can fall in either category, so that is a complication. But in general, you need to, when you're pricing for an order, you need to include absolutely everything that is a direct cost. So everything that is a cost you're incurring as a direct result of accepting that order. And you want to also make some contribution towards the overhead running costs of your business. So going a bit more into some of the elements of cost, materials, as we've said. Now, materials are largely a direct cost. There are some situations in which there are materials you might consider to be an indirect cost. So, for example, if you always have glue in your workshop, you might think that that is more of an indirect cost, but you can actually work out how much you need of it for a particular order. Labor is, there is typically a direct labor component, and there can often be an indirect labor component also, but we're not going to worry too much about the indirect costs today. This is, for this workshop, we're focusing on calculating direct costs, and then just indicating that you should make a contribution towards indirect costs and towards profit. But machine costs can be, as I've said, direct or indirect. There can also be some other direct costs in certain situations. We'll talk a bit more about that later. And basically the idea is to stack up all of these different elements of costs and including whatever profit you need to make, and come out with a price that you can quote to a customer. So we're starting off with the material cost. So now, for each material cost, there are two elements to it. There's the cost per unit and the number of units. Sounds really simple, but there are a couple of pitfalls with each that I just want to point out. So starting off with the cost per unit, you need to think about all of the costs of getting that material to where you need it. Now, as an example, if you're going to make, if you're going to 3D print something and you're buying filament, you're importing filament, say from China to your country, the price that the filament supplier tells you, the price per kilogram, is not your cost per kilogram, okay? That's just one element of it, because you also need to pay for shipping to get it to you. You may also need to pay import duties. You may need to go and collect it from the port or from a warehouse, and that might be a cost. Now, some of these can be charged per kilo. Some of them might be charged per order, like you go and collect the order once, no matter how many kilos you've ordered. So you can make a little table and include these different costs, working out how each one occurs. Like, is it per quantity of the item, or is it just once per order? And then work out the total for an order, for the order that you need to do for a particular job, and then divide that by the number of units. So in this worked example, we can see that although your supplier may say the filament costs $20 per kilo, you can see when you've added up all the other costs, it can come out to nearly $37 per kilo in an order of 3 kilos. And if you were to order a different quantity, that price would be slightly different. So that's working out the cost per unit. Then you also need to work out how many units you're going to need for a particular order. And that is worked out as the quantity per unit times the number of units you'll need to make. So a simple example to start with, if a bill of materials for something calls for 8 screws per product and you're making 20 products, then you're going to need 160 screws. But you also need to remember to account for wastage. So if, for example, we just talked about 3D printing products, if you're 3D printing something that needs 100 grams of filament per product, you're going to make 20 products, but you're also going to need to make, let's say you estimate 4 samples before you get to the first good one to make sure you've got all your settings right and things like that. If you can reuse that filament, then fine, you don't need to include it in the cost. But if that's a waste to you and that's a cost, then you need to include the cost. So if there were 4 samples that are not going to be good, then you need to include those in terms of the number of units. So coming back to the material cost, you've worked out the cost per unit, you've worked out the number of units, you multiply that to give you your material cost. And you need to do that for every single material that the product needs. And don't forget about things like fixings, like screws, consumables like glue, any packaging, anything at all that you need a certain quantity for to make the products should be included. And you work out each material cost and add them all up to get to your total material cost. I'm just going to pause at them for a brief second before we go on to the next one to see if anyone's got any questions before we move on to the next topic. Okay, so that was material costs, which is one of the direct costs that we talked about because it can be exactly attributed to making a particular product. Now we're going to talk about labor costs, and it can be the case that the labor costs we're talking about is you. Maybe you are the business owner and the maker and the admin person and everything. Or it could be that you also employ some other people. I can see a hand up. Yes, Martin, please ask.
All right, thank you, Anna. You're doing amazing work. What happened to the cost of material in a case where you only need to use a small piece of it and you are not even certain of the next piece when you can use it? How does it affect the particular production?
That's a very good question, Martin. So many items that you buy, they have to be bought in a certain quantity. So if we think about glue, maybe you need some special glue to make a product and you can only buy it in a full tube, even if you only need a quarter of that tube for this job. Now, if you are confident that you're going to have other orders that will let you use the rest of that material up, then you could just include the amounts that you'll need for this order in your pricing for this order. But if you're not sure, about whether you'll be able to have other orders that will need it, or it could be a long time in the future, then it's better to include the total cost in this order so that you're not out of pocket. Does that make sense, Martin? Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes.
Good. Okay, so on to the labor costs. So whether it's you as a business owner doing it all yourself, or whether you've got employees, somebody has to spend time on all sorts of things to do with the order. So buying the materials, like for example, if you need to go to a market and search out to find the right types of screw and the right thickness of metal, you know, that can take time. You need to include that time in your estimate. In the IMA project, the design of the product is going to be provided, but in some cases you may need to be developing a design yourselves, or adapting a design for your machinery or something like that. So any work on the design and to set up production, so time that you spend getting the equipment ready for this particular job, making sure the settings are right, running test batches, anything like that. All of this time needs to be included in the time that you spend on the job. Then it's the time to actually make the products, which is what most people think of as the direct labor cost. There may be also other time afterwards to quality check, to finish or pack or ship the products. Maybe you've got to take them somewhere. And there can be time to deal with admin for the order. So the total labor involved in accepting this order involves all of those different types of time. And you also need to remember to include any tax costs, whether it's for you or for other employees, and associated admin with that. So that's what I wanted to say about labor costs. Again, if you've got any questions, please do come in at any time. We're going to talk next about what I'm terming machine costs. And when I say machines, it could also be tools, it could be equipment, anything. It's any resources that you need in order to be able to make products. It could also include safety equipment, it could include test equipment, anything like that. Now, as I mentioned before, machine costs can include both direct and indirect elements, so it can be a little bit complex to work them out. If you are like an independent maker and you're going to hire machines at a makerspace to produce an order, then that really simplifies the costing thing from the point of view of machines, because generally the makerspace will have a price per machine hour or half day or however they charge it, and you will be able to get that price and use that in your quote. If you're using your own facilities, then you need to make sure that you're covering all cost elements. And of course, makerspaces who want to know how to set the prices to charge for their machines also need to think about all of these elements. So one of them is the energy cost to run the machine, if it's any kind of automated machine or power tool. And you may also need to think about that the energy source may differ, like maybe you can usually get grid electricity, but sometimes you have to use a generator and that's more expensive. So you need to make sure you account for the energy cost, whatever the source is. There is a cost of the depreciation of the machine. So a machine doesn't last indefinitely. So if it's your own machine, you need to think about the fact that maybe it needs to be replaced at some point, and you need to be making an allowance each year towards the actual cost of a new machine. I'm just checking on, there's a question in the chat. Okay, would you mind sharing the slides? Absolutely, yes. I meant to say that at the start. I will. I think everyone has had to register to join this meeting, so we should have all the email addresses. So yes, we'll share the slides, and they have been. I've put a lot of information on the slides rather than just them pictures and things, so that hopefully they should be useful as a reference guide afterwards. So machine depreciation needs to be included. Also maintenance and repair costs. So there might be some maintenance that has to be done periodically to keep the machine in good order. There might be spare parts needed. Maybe it breaks down. Sometimes you need to repair it. All of those things, you should make an allowance towards the costs of doing those things. There can also be machine consumables like oil or something like that, that the machine just needs every so often. And so those are all of the cost elements that you need to think about in terms of using the machine. But when you're calculating how long you'll use it for, you also need to think about any wastage. So if we go back to the example that we had on the materials, if you're going to make 4 extra products to test the settings and so on, then you need to account for the time that those will be on the machine as well. So that time will need to be accounted for in the labor costs and in the machine costs. So coming on to the effects of timing. This is something that people often forget about. So it's important to think about, if you're preparing a quote for a product you're going to make, how long that quote will be valid for. Some organizations, particularly big NGOs and things, or governments, will ask for quotes really a long time in advance of when they need the item, because they have long processes. That can make things really difficult, because if you are being asked to give a quote now and you're going to make the item, let's say in 6 months' time, prices might not still be the same. So you need to think about that. You need to think about the effects of inflation. It could be that, you know, all the prices in your country are going up, and so, you know, your labor costs are going to increase and everything. It could be there are currency fluctuations, and if you're buying items that come from abroad, whether you're importing them directly yourself or whether somebody else is, those currency fluctuations are likely to be passed on to you in some way. There can also be commodity price changes. So things like if you need a certain grade of steel, then that can be, the price can fluctuate according to the global commodity markets. So those are all important things to think about. Another timing effect is how long you will have to make the items and whether there are any extra costs involved in that. So if you quote for making something under ideal conditions at the lowest price, you might not then be able to make it for the same price if you're only given a 2-week turnaround to make the items. Because maybe you quoted for the shipping prices that you quoted to get your materials might only be valid for a sea shipment, and you actually need to pay for expedited shipping and an air shipment to get the materials in time. Or it could be that you wanted to be able to buy something locally from your preferred supplier who's much cheaper, but that if the items aren't available and you don't have long to get them, that you have to go somewhere more expensive. And the same could apply to machine usage. Maybe you thought you would be able to get access to a machine that you can use cheaply, but if you've got to do it in a hurry, maybe you have to pay extra to access a machine. So anything, there may be premium prices involved in doing things faster. Make sure to include all of those. Couple of points of advice that I wanted to make from experience. First one is to make sure you check your assumptions. Okay, use accurate exchange rates. We often have like mental shortcuts for what the exchange rate is. So you might think, oh, in my currency, there's usually about 4 to the dollar. But in reality, it might be fluctuating between 3.5 and 4.5 to the dollar. When you're working out pricing, that kind of difference can actually have quite a significant impact. So I would really recommend that you use accurate exchange rates, and you think about how you're going to change the money, because if you just look up online for what the exchange rate is now, you know, the sort of the international bank rate, but if you go to a local money changer, you're not going to get that same rate. So make sure you use a realistic rate for what it's actually going to cost you to change the money. Remember, as I've said, that prices can change over time. Don't assume that you know the price of an item because you bought it last year for a different job. You know, it could have changed in the meantime. You also need to think about how quantity affects costs. So if you buy more of something, you can often get a quantity discount. But if let's say you bought a lot of something last year for an order, you might not be able to get the same price again, even if the prices haven't changed, just because you're buying a smaller quantity this time. So it's always important to think about that as well. The other key recommendation I would make is to use a spreadsheet to calculate these kind of things. It's really good to make sure that you've got full documentation so that you can go back to it, you know, some weeks later, and you can understand all the different cost elements. You can remember how you've worked it out, and letting the machine do the calculations takes a lot of the potential for error out. And these points I'm making, for some of you may be quite basic, but for others who don't have as much experience using spreadsheets, I just want to make the points anyway. One piece of data, like an exchange rate, should only appear one place in the spreadsheet. That is so that if it changes, you've only got one place to update it, and you're not going to end up with like lots of different exchange rates in different places in your spreadsheet, for example. The calculations should be done automatically. I have sometimes seen people who are using a spreadsheet program to calculate things, but are actually doing it manually, like working it out on their phone calculator and typing the numbers in the cells. I don't recommend doing that. Build it up properly in the spreadsheet. It's much less error prone. Check all of your logic, double check it, and also sanity check the results. Make sure that the kind of numbers that are coming out are what you would expect. And onto a final checklist of things to just make sure once you've got an initial idea of the price. Have you included the costs of absolutely everything that you'll need to buy or do as a result of this order? So we talked particularly about materials, machine use, and labor. In some situations, there might be other direct costs as well. So if you were making something big and you had to store them for 2 weeks before the customer is going to be ready for them, maybe you need to pay something for that storage. That's then a cost directly attributable to this order. If you need to, once you've made the products, deliver them to somewhere else, to the customer, that's a transport cost. You need to make sure that is included. Second point, have you included an allowance towards your overhead costs and to make a profit? Now, we haven't talked a lot about this today. We've focused on the direct costs because there are many different ways to calculate overheads according to different business types, and it's quite difficult to give a sort of general introduction to that. But just to make sure that you have got some funds going towards the costs that you have, every week, every month for running your business. Even if you don't have your own premises, maybe you have a website that you need to maintain. Maybe you need, you have some tax or company registration costs that need to be covered, things like that. So you need to make sure you're making an allowance towards those and to make a profit. If you've included all your time as direct labor, then the amount of profit you would make is less. But if you're not properly accounting for your labor, then you might need to include more of that in the profit. The key thing is just to make sure that you've covered the value of your time somewhere. Next, have you checked your assumptions about prices and currencies and quantities and things like that, as we've just talked about? And have you thought about the effects of order timing and included any allowances you need to make for risk? So if you're giving a quote that's going to be valid for 3 months, what might the currency do in those 3 months? So you can include an allowance for risk. If the currency values do change, you might then make more or less money. But at least you've thought about it and you've got it built in some way. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation that I've got for you. And now I'm very happy to answer any questions. And if somebody has an example that they would like to bring to the group and we can work through as an example, I'm also happy to do that. Thank you. So I don't see any particular questions at the moment. I wanted to ask, so I think we have got people here who are going to put in bids for the IMA contracts. Is there anyone who would be prepared to tell us about their situation, and we could just together walk through what cost elements you would need to think about in that situation? everybody's being quiet and reticent, I think, today. Jessica, Andrew, are there any comments that you'd like to make in terms of how this relates to the quote that you're going to ask for, or anything like that? We've got a, question here.
Before you dive into the questions that are, there's a question in the chat. Anna, thank you very much for doing this. There's a few things in there, particularly that point about the exchange rate, which is quite an important thing for us to bear in mind when we do this experiment of the manufacturing trial. And I know in many countries recently, just in the normal procurement systems of some of the aid agencies that I've been engaging with recently, the variations in the exchange rate cause an enormous problem. And in fact, for producers in the farming industry in the UK, I mean, it's national news when they agree a price and then months later the exchange rate is so radically different and they get put out of business. So I really liked your point about just don't use the mental exchange rate, because as I'm but I really appreciate this workshop. Do you want to respond to the question in the chat? And then Anna, I'm happy to sort of present the template quotation and the contract that I've drafted for that people might be interested to use.
Right. Okay, so a couple of questions from the chat. One about whether there were any links shared in the first half of the call. There weren't. We haven't shared the presentation yet, but we will do. It'll be shared to everybody who registered. I don't know if it's possible for people to be here who haven't registered, but if that's the case, then just get in touch and we can also share the slides with anybody. Secondly, there's a question about who should bear the cost of transport. And this, again, it's a great question. There isn't a simple answer to this, but I would say the main thing is to be clear about what is included in a quote. So you can include the delivery costs in the quote, or you can include or you can exclude it. It's common for, if you're buying things internationally, there is a set of what are called Incoterms, and I'll put a link in the chat to that in a few moments, which specify whether a price being quoted includes delivery or not, and exactly where in the chain it includes the delivery up to. The cost to the customer, if a customer's asking for a quote, they may well specify what they want, like, please quote for this many items to be delivered to this place. In that case, you should include the cost of the delivery. If they don't specify, then feel free to include it or not, but in either way, say so on the quote. So just be really clear. So Jessica, did you want to come in with something?
Yes, sorry, it was just because there was a few questions during our last monthly checking meeting with the cohort of the EMA, and one of the question was about how to include, or should they include, the shipping cost in case of outsourcing the production if the production is made somewhere else. Is it something that the makers should include in their bids? And the second question was about the currency, because they will be applying for different countries in Africa, in Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa, and they're asking about which currencies you should bid in. So that was just some questions we had about on the last monthly call. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't have all the details of what you, what the quote is, but I would say that the main thing is to be clear about what is included in the quote. So if a customer's asking for a quote, they may well specify what they want, like, please quote for this many items to be delivered to this place. In that case, you should include the cost of the delivery. If they don't specify, then feel free to include it or not, but in either way, say so on the quote. what is being asked for in the IMA quote. So I'm going to let Andrew go through that. But from a general point of view, the most important thing is always to be clear on your quote of what's included and what isn't, what currency you're using, and what conditions the quote is valid for. And there's a comment from Felix in the chat saying, due to currency fluctuations, they've added terms to our quotes that will only hold a price for 5 working days. Now, that's an excellent solution. That's the kind of thing that you may need to do if you're in a situation of significant volatility. You know, sometimes 5 working days is the right amount. It might be, you know, a month, but whatever it is, think about how long you're happy to be bound by the terms of the quote. Sorry, I'm just trying. There's quite a few messages now. I'm not sure I've answered all the ones above. So let me just. So I've answered the question about the cost of transport. There's a production is an art, not a science. Please share the contrast. I'm not sure I quite understand what's being asked there. Albert Kipruto, could you perhaps unmute and ask the question again, or else type it in the chat?
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the session. I needed to get the difference. How is production just an art and not a science in essence?
Okay. So I was talking about pricing rather than production, although you can definitely argue that production is an art too. But the point I was trying to make is that when it comes to setting a price for products that you make, there is not necessarily one way to do it that will get you the same answers every time and that is exactly the right way. There are different approaches, and there are, you know, you're dealing with uncertainty. When you're preparing a quote, you're making an offer that somebody might take up at some point in the future. So you're also dealing with uncertainty. So you've got to sort of build in allowances for that. So it's not a question of trying to get to the single right answer. It's about trying to work out what is going to be a good price for you that you can commit to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think I missed the point. Was pricing, not production. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Welcome. There's a question from Melinao about access to a template. I think Andrew's going to talk to you a bit about that in a moment, so I'll hold off on that. Question from Rahema. When making sales, is it advised to ask the customer to pay for transactions in order to retain your profit? So again, you can do it either way, but the point is to be clear about it and to know that you've properly accounted for everything. So if you're going to include the cost of the transaction in your costs, just make sure you've made an allowance to cover that, and then you've got some profit on top. If you're not going to include it, then make that really clear in the quote. Hopefully that answers the question. If you have any more questions, please come back on that. We've got a quote from a comment from Felix saying costing is science, pricing is art. I'm afraid I don't entirely agree with that, Felix. I think that there are so many variables and different approaches you can use that even costing itself is is not necessarily a precise science. But happy to debate that further. Any more questions at all? I think I've gone through all the ones that are in the chat, but if I've missed any, or if you've got any additional questions, please shout out now. Otherwise, I'm going to hand over in just a moment to Andrew. Okay, Andrew, over to you.
Thanks. And thanks for the question about a a template so that the quotation is uniform across the network? The short answer is it is possible to have a template, but you don't have to use it. And I'm going to share with you the template that I've created this morning. Let's see if I can share that. But you don't have, the reason you don't have to use it, there's, if everyone else can cancel their videos, please, so you can see this on the screen. Yeah, so the reason you don't have to use it is because you may have your own way of doing things. But the reason this template might be helpful, and we'll share this, Jessica will send a link to this as a Google document after the meeting. The reason to do this is just to make sure that we get all the information that we're looking for in the quote. Now, you might have your own sort of portfolio. You might want to share with us your, quotes from previous customers, to try and convince us to buy from you, sort of thing. And you might want to give us more information on pricing than we're asking for, to base, the different quantities and so on. But basically, I'm going to show you now the different, the basic sort of fields that we're looking for, and then we'll share this with you as a document afterwards. So the other thing about this quotation template is that it will essentially become the contract. We're not going to ask people necessarily to sign the contract, but you'll see in writing in this document that, essentially it's written as a contract. So the basic terms of the agreement and the things that we need for the quote are: we need your name, we need the minimum quantity and the price for that minimum quantity, recognizing that that price might be different for higher quantities. We need the maximum quantity that you're willing to make and what the price for that maximum quantity might be. Then distributed manufacturing, we will choose how many we would like you to make, somewhere between that minimum and maximum. And then we'll pay you to make those items. Delivery will then be to the participating makerspace. Production is supposed to be between the 1st of September and the 15th of September. So production should absolutely be finished by the 15th of September, which is 1 month from now, for this first item of the 3D printed writing aid. So tell us your name, the minimum quantity, the maximum quantity, and the price for each of those, and then which is your nearest participating makerspace and the date you hope to deliver it by. We would like to know the total price per item. We want to know how much we're going to pay you. And we're not interested in paying for any international shipping, but local delivery to the makerspace that you're associated with, or to your nearest participating makerspace, is it should be included in the cost, please. In the price, I should say. Right. Something unusual, but absolutely essential for this trial, is that we would like to know what machines you're going to use. And there's a form, there's a link to it in the request for quotations, and there's a link to it here again in this document when it's shared. We'd like to know what machines you're using. You might use 1 machine, you might use 20 machines. We'd like to know we'd like to know that there is a record being added to our map of machines for every machine that you're going to use, please. And the same for the maker, or if there's going to be more than one of you, each maker should have a maker passport. We would like to contract as much as possible with individuals, but if you'd rather apply as an organization, say you and a couple of colleagues have a small 3D printing business, and the three of you might use the makerspace, you might have your own 3D printer. We can contract with your organization, but the template is based on working with an individual. Just let us know, and we can change the name of the maker to the name of the organization of makers, but you'll still need to be associated with that local makerspace. So for this particular, to repeat this particular trial, we require from you the machines to be on the mat and the makers to have maker passports as part of the project. And that's just because of the project we're working on. Some quality requirements. Quality inspections will be done by the makerspace, the nearest participating makerspace in the project to you, the maker. So your local makerspace, of the 9 that are listed at the top of the document. And then you can choose 2 things. Either you pay the makerspace to do a quality inspection. So the price of the quality inspection has to be agreed with the makerspace and included in your price. But either you can pay them once we've paid you, or we can pay the makerspace on your behalf. So you need to tell us, in that case, how much of your price, either in dollars or as a percentage per item, should we pay to the local makerspace. I hope that makes sense. So quality inspections should be included in your total price, and then you tell us if you're going to pay the makerspace to do the quality inspection, or if we are going to pay the makerspace to do the quality inspection on your behalf. And if you want us to pay the makerspace on your behalf, you have to tell us how much. We will let you know if there's any problems, if those quality inspections find any problems. We will ask you to replace any or repair any items that we think don't conform with the standard that we're looking for, which is defined in the specification document. And we're looking for a label. Every item that is to be made, and this is a cost that has to be included in the price, has to have your name, the product name, the date of production, and an item number. It might be item number 1 of 25, 2 of 25, 3 of 25, 1 of 100, 2 of 100, 1 of 1, whatever it might be. But we'd like to have these markings on each of the items that you make and deliver to the makerspace. And the other thing we want to tell you is that we're going to be gathering feedback. So if you want feedback on, we'll be getting feedback from the users and we'll share it. Now, I see there's a question about how do you agree the price for the quality inspection. You have to speak with the makerspace and decide that. The makerspace will have a we've told them roughly what the budget is. We're expecting this work to be very, very quick. So for 300 items to be inspected, I would expect that to take at most an hour just to look at them and go, yes, fine, fine. We might select a couple and weigh them. We might select a couple and do some of the quality tests that are described in the specification document, but you need to agree a price with the local makerspace, because that's one of the experiments we're trying to conduct with this. So send a WhatsApp message to or an email to your local makerspace, speak to your local makerspace manager, and say, you know, how much do you want to do this inspection? It will not be very much. The items that we're making here are, for this particular trial, the 3D printed writing aids are supposed to be very affordable, very low cost items. In the next couple of trials, we'll be doing more expensive items, but these should be very low costs. And I'm hesitating to put a percentage or to put a guide price in here. But yeah, if you have any problems coming to an agreement on that, that's something that we'd be really interested to find out about. And there's contact details in this document. I think there was also a question I saw appear in the chat, which is about how the marking should be added. Entirely up to you. It could be, you know, a sticky label attached to it. It could be something you embed in the plastic if you wanted to, although that might be extra work. And it could also just be, you know, a string attached, or it could be in a paper bag with handwriting on, you know, or an envelope. You know, go and buy some cheap envelopes from a stationery shop and put one inside each envelope and just label it that way. It's entirely up to you. If you want to make packaging for the product, some nice laser cut packaging or something, then you could use the laser to mark it. But again, these are meant to be low cost products. You know, we don't want to create lots of extra work. So it's whatever you think is affordable within the price. I would try and keep, my recommendation to you is try and keep the costs as low as possible for this particular trial. Permanent marker's fine. Yeah.
There's another question about
Thank you.
how do we determine a price for quality inspection, and if there's any recognized standard they should be using for that?
No, there's no recognized standard. Yeah, I've spoken about you need to agree with the makerspace, but there isn't really a recognized standard as such.
There's another question from Kwakuefa about how about using a permanent marker to make the markings?
Yeah, I said, yeah, I spoke to that as well. Good. Okay. Right, this section is about payment planning. You should tell us how you want to be paid. Normally, in a lot of production contracts, you get paid several days after you, or a month even, after you deliver the product. We're trying to do a different kind of experiment here. So you tell us when you want to be paid. Do you want to be paid a percentage before production begins, during production, upon delivery, or after completion of the inspections? Give us a percentage for each of those stages. If you want us to pay the makerspace for the quality inspections so that you don't have to, you need to deduct that payment or that amount from this percentage, basically. So 100% would include the quality inspections, deduct the percentage for that we would pay the makerspace on your behalf if you want us to do that for you, and then break down the rest. If you don't specify a payment schedule to us, we will pay you within 15 days of delivery. So the latest date will be the 30th of September. So you can be sure you'll be paid by the 30th of September. Now, this whole thing is optional. In some cases, you might be using the makerspace machines. The maker might be using the makerspace machines to make the product. And the makerspace might charge you for the use of its machines. In that case, we can pay the makerspace on your behalf. You might use the materials provided by the makerspace. In that case, we can pay the makerspace on your behalf if you want us to. If you want us to do that, let us know, and we will deduct that from the amount that we pay you and pay them on your behalf. So the quality inspections, the payments to the makerspace are required because in every case, the makerspace is going to be doing the quality inspections. But in the case of using the materials and the machines, you might use your own, you might use the makerspaces. So these are optional things that you can tell us. Just let us know how you want us to deal with paying for the materials and the use of machines. We've got a section here about warranty, guarantee, liability, intellectual property. It's an open source design, but we'd still like you to respect that. We don't want you to try and patent the open source design. We will not be requiring any warranty or guarantee from you for this. And we will make sure that the user knows that, that they will have to accept liability. We are not selling these products to the users. When you're donating products like this, you can have a clause in there that you don't accept any liability. And then enforcement is basically about, in disputes, is let us know if there's any problems in the, if you're going to be delayed, if there's a big problem with the cost of materials, if the machine is broken, if there's a power cut for a week and you can't use the machine, let us know about any problems. And if you fail to deliver and you haven't communicated with us, we will potentially add that breach of contract to your maker passport. Right. The last thing is, and this is entirely optional, Anna has just done a great presentation about pricing. We would love to know if you'd be willing to share with us how you have worked out your pricing. So we'd like to know if, how that comes together. Now this is not a required part of the quotation. You don't need to tell us how you arrived at the price, but we'd really like to know because that helps us with our experiment, with our research, with our trial here. So if you'd like to let us know, please do. If after you actually make these things for us, if you're selected for a contract, you make these things for us, and the reality is different to the quote, we'd love to hear from you about that too. And that's often one of the big dangers in manufacturing is, you make a loss, you make a product, you make a profit on any particular product. The profit is higher or lower than you expected, whatever it might be. We'd love to hear from you. So there's a little request here at the bottom of the template, not a required part of the quotation. If you'd be willing to share your calculations with us and say, you know what, there's something that's really important here in this particular part of the country that is a huge factor that maybe doesn't apply to other places, we'd love to learn about that. So please share your information with us. But this document will be shared with you as a Google document. The yellow bits are the bits that we really need to know for the quote. You can use this template if you want to. You can use your own template, but this is quite a good guide, and it will begin to be the contract that we issue to you. So thank you very much. The quotations deadline is coming up, so please get the quotes in to us, and please let us know if you have any questions along the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. If there's any question on the contract template before we wrap up this session, if there's any question on the pricing, please just jump in if you'd like to. Well, if there's no question, we will then stop the recording and stop the session. I will quickly share with you again the email address that you can use to ask any question related to the bids. So please have here, you can write directly to contract at distributing manufacturing if you have any questions on the quotation, your submission, etc. If there's any question of pricing or the contract template, all the document, the presentation, and the contract template will be shared with you all. And thank you. I don't know if Anna, you want to say something before we wrap up, before we close. Thank you very much for your presentation again. Thank you, Andrew, for the template.
My pleasure. Nothing else I want to add, but just to let you know that I've shared the presentation with you, Jessica. So if you could distribute it to the participants, that would be great. Thanks.
Absolutely, I will do. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Well, now you know what you have to do. Just send your bids, please, and then we can select. Hi, Kwaku. Thank you very much, and we are waiting to receive your bids. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
See you soon
everyone.
in production. Bye-bye.